I don't know what one can expect in terms of foreign policy in general. If I were a Ukrainian, I would worry. If I were a NATO member, I would worry. And as an Israeli, I would worry.
Well, Mr. Rabinovich, first of all, thank you so much for joining us. How
Sure.
significant could the US election be, both for Israel, but also the broader situation in the Middle East at the moment?
Uh, it is a very significant election, not just for Israel and the Middle East. I think globally, obviously, it's very important for the whole world to know and to have the reality of who is the president and what the administration is. And particularly now, when there is a major crisis in the Middle East that can probably not be resolved before there is a functioning administration. The Biden administration is fading. We don't know who the next president will be, whether Mr. Trump, whose foreign policy can be very haphazard, or Kamala Harris, who doesn't have her own record on so much on foreign policy. So lots of question marks around this issue.
Do you think this US election matters more than most?
Yes, because the only power that can intervene and try to turn a crisis into an opportunity, be it in other parts of the world, but specifically so in the Middle East, is the United States. I personally, as ambassador to the US, as a peace negotiator with Syria, could see firsthand what the Bush administration with Mr. Baker, Secretary of State, and the Clinton administration with the President, Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, could do and what role they played. And I cannot think of a more important time. There was the Gaza war, the war in Lebanon, the prospect of a full-fledged Iranian-Israeli war that could become a full Middle Eastern war with implications for world security, oil supply, the nuclear issue at stake as well is a huge issue. And therefore, an effective US administration determined to invest in turning crisis into opportunity and capable of doing that is of course very, very essential.
Who do you think privately Benjamin Netanyahu will hope to see in the White House after this election?
Netanyahu makes no secret of his preference for Mr. Trump. They ended on a bad note because Netanyahu, after a while, did congratulate President Biden on his election, and Trump was very cross at him and spoke ill of him. But possibly 4 years later, this has been forgotten. And I think he feels much more comfortable with Mr. Trump than with Ms. Harris. And I don't think he even cares to make a secret of it. And he is obviously on bad terms with President Biden. President Biden is quoted by Bob Woodward, speaks ill of him. They spoke yesterday, pretty much after Prime Minister Netanyahu pressured him to have this conversation. He grounded his Minister of Defense, stopped him from going to Washington to coordinate the Israeli response to the Iranian missile attack on Israel, because he wanted the president to speak to him. That happened for about half an hour. We still don't know what exactly took place in the conversation, but I think this is probably a relationship that cannot be fixed, but both sides realize that for the next few months they have to live with one another.
And can you just expand on why Netanyahu prefers Trump? I know in his first term, for example, he moved the US embassy to Jerusalem, but are there other reasons why Netanyahu would prefer to see Trump win?
Not just move the embassy to Jerusalem, also recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, closed down the PLO office in Washington, stopped military assistance to the Palestinians. He was very, very, very clear on that. But I would say his support for Israel was not tested by a major crisis. Remember that we have Russia in Syria, we have Iran. There could be serious crises in which U.S. support for and cooperation with Israel could be tested. I would say that if you look at the crisis of October 7, President Biden's support for Israel was actually exemplary in terms of the support, the threats or the warnings to Iran and Hezbollah, the dispatching of naval forces to the region, and his own visit to Israel. So I don't think one could ask for more. But I should say openly, I'm not a supporter of Prime Minister Netanyahu. I cannot find a good explanation for everything that he does, but for his own reasons, good or not, he seems to prefer Trump to Ms. Harris.
And President Biden has said recently that he's unsure whether Netanyahu is holding off on agreeing a ceasefire deal in Gaza in order to influence the US presidential election in some way. Do you believe Netanyahu is trying to sway the US election?
I'm not sure that this is the case. I hope it is not, because I cannot think of something more foolish to do than for an Israeli prime minister to actually intervene in American politics. It happened over several decades. It happened once. Uncareful Israeli president who seemed to support Jimmy Carter at the time, but normally in such an intimate, important relationship, both parties need to know how to work with one another and try to keep away from meddling in each other's politics.
And then on how the Israeli government would view Kamala Harris, I mean, I understand what you say about the breakdown in relations between Biden and Netanyahu, even though Joe Biden throughout his career has been a really strong ally of Israel. Is there a sense that Kamala Harris is slightly less naturally supportive of Israel? And does that make Israelis wary?
Yeah, I'd like to draw a distinction between supporting Israel and supporting Netanyahu. I think that there were indications that she's not supportive of Netanyahu, and most important, when he gave his speech in Congress, she was not there. And there were a couple of comments that she made that indicated that she's not enthusiastic about Netanyahu, which she probably picked up. So it could be a sort of a relationship in which both sides indicate to one another they're not great mutual admirers, and in a way a self-fulfilling prophecy.
If it were Donald Trump back in the White House, do you think he would have, because of maybe a better relationship with Netanyahu, do you think he would have more influence over Israeli policy when it comes to Gaza and when it comes to Lebanon?
Given his temper and his decision-making pattern, I don't know what to expect. He could decide that enough is enough, that this war and crisis need to come to an end, and just try to force it. He could do that. I remember when he was president, remember his own Secretary of Defense resigned when President Trump told the President Erdogan of Turkey, "Oh, if you want Syria, you can have it." Not your standard foreign policy making, led to the resignation of the Secretary of Defense. Remember how many national security advisors came and went. So, and all kind of peculiar episodes. He's meeting in Helsinki with President Putin, with only a Russian translator in the room, not a second American present in the room. Who knows what went on in that meeting? all kind of peculiar episodes. So I don't know what one can expect in terms of foreign policy in general. If I were a Ukrainian, I would worry. If I were a NATO member, I would worry. And as an Israeli, I would worry.
And just finally, what do you think ordinary Israelis feel about the US election? I appreciate they will have different views, but is there a consensus as to who most Israelis would like to see in the White House?
Ordinary Israelis, are not deep thinkers about foreign policy. We're impressed by the gestures made by Trump at the time. They probably think that he's very friendly. And there may be a slight preference for him, but ordinary Israelis don't make the difference. It's the government and the elite who make the difference.
Mr. Rabinovich, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.